All is an autobibliography. It's a project that makes use of manuscripts, which have been in my collection since I wrote them, starting in the early 60s, so more than 50 years, and I call it All the Books I Never Wrote, or wrote and never published, because it consists of works that were fully developed, full-length novels or other kinds of works, as well as promises for books, notes, outlines, chapter headings, bits and pieces of works that I conceived and never followed through on. This is the room where I work in my house in Los Angeles. It's a quiet space, and the room is pretty much this desk is pretty much dedicated to this project. I can sit here and read through the manuscripts, think about them, and think about not just what they say or the period of my life from which they come, but how they embody an attitude towards writing. I'm interested in why I wrote so much and why the constant writing served different kinds of purposes. The manuscripts take different kinds of forms. They're all preserved. I had started to organize them before I left Virginia 10 years ago to move back to California. At that time, I took representative scans of each of the manuscripts, usually the front page or the title page, as well as samples of things like outlines that were in the back of the manuscripts or notes for other projects. I also made PDFs so that the full extent of the manuscripts might be available online. The project takes two forms. It's meant to be both an analog project and be able to be printed out in PDF or eventually in a book format, but also to live online. Online, there'll be supplementary materials, galleries of photographs, images, PDFs, correspondence, other kinds of notations, and it'll make use of a web architecture and an online architecture in order to link various supporting materials to the texts themselves. But the core of the project really consists of all of the manuscripts of writings from these 50 years. They're organized in archival folders. They all have unique IDs, and they all are, in various degrees of fairly good shape. To keep track of everything, I started by making a list. This was originally simply written on a notebook, a notepad. I transferred it into a spreadsheet, the titles of the works, the form in which they were written, the time, the place, the unique ID, the number of pages, is it finished or not. And then there were other bits of data and metadata that I used to try to organize the manuscripts. And here you see a detail. There are multiple images and files related to projects from the 1970s, Whole, Pupa House. You can see their drawings, typescripts, tables of contents, and other materials that are relevant to the project. I also started to think about how to chunk the manuscripts and organize them for presentation. So here you see some notes about places in which I lived corresponding to various decades. It's actually not particularly accurate. I didn't live in Oakland in the 2000s, but the idea was to think, well, places and locations might have one kind of organizing structure for, kind of making the periods of my life, the kind of autochronology visible and apparent as part of the structure of the presentation. This is one of the earliest manuscripts in the collection. It's a little spiral-bound notebook, 29 cents, pen tab. You can see my name there inscribed on the cover. Yes, multiply inscribed. Obviously the pencil wasn't strong enough, so I used pen. And then you can see the very first page of the manuscript here, the letter. It was a fatal romance. And you can see the curly decorations on the capital Y on the majuscule and various emendations that I made. But basically the novel is written straight out in pencil and then pen in this notebook. At the back of the notebook is this poem, The Arbor, and other notes for other projects. The arbor was meant to be a kind of motif here, set up to introduce what was going to be another novel. It became a short novelette that then I incorporated into another project further along, a 400-page novel that I wrote the year that I was 12, called Roddy. At the same time that I was writing these fictions, I became involved in a relationship. The first serious relationship of my life was an adolescent, 12, 13. And I began to write about that relationship as well. There are many, many manuscripts at intermittent periods about that extended relationship. I call them the Amy manuscripts. And here you can see fragments of it that were written in the late 1960s and early 70s, when I was still trying to process what the relationship had meant and how to deal with its complexities, its intimacies, its intensities, and its conflicts, which were many. On we go into the 1970s, many things in between. These are just a few samples of the kinds of things that are in the manuscript collection. 1977, I decided to leave California, where I was working among a group of poets, and to travel. You can see the unique ID here written in pencil, 0057_01. This is a reportage piece on deck with Raoul, and it was about someone I saw on a boat as I was on my way from Italy to Greece. You can see that the typescript has a filled counter in the A and in the D. The typescript identify different periods in the writing and allow you to can sort of group them together by when they were typed as well as when they were written. The paperclip is pretty rusty. This manuscript, for instance, was probably typed right before I left California in 1979. I think it's written on an IBM Selectric with a film ribbon. It's a very clean typescript, a poem that was meant to be a kind of manifesto, hence the pun, about issues related to energy and feminist persona. This is another reportage piece written in 1978 around a poetry festival that I attended in Amsterdam. Many people from my Oakland life showed up there, as well as people who stayed in my life afterwards. Tom Rayworth is mentioned at the very beginning of the second paragraph. His name is misspelled. These are notes for that event. You can see Lewis McAdams is mentioned as well. He was present, as was Anne Waldman. It was an interesting experience. 1978, I went to Greece and wrote this long novel called Greece and Good Behavior. The novel was really about issues in gendered identity and how to manage them in the context in which I was living in Santorini with a friend, a travel companion, and the various men that we met and dated and so forth. Here's the outline of chapters. Section 1 is called Defining the Limits. And then the chapters are things like Getting There, begins with the Strongs, the Greek lesson, conversation, and so forth. So all the notes that had to do with developing the novel are also present in the archive as part of the working process of thinking through its issues and how it would develop. The manuscript itself was typed once I was in Amsterdam. I don't have the original notebooks, but here's part of the original typescript with annotations on it. Keep in mind that all these annotated manuscripts had to be retyped in their entirety in the 1970s and early 80s in order to make clean copy. There were no shortcuts, no ways to use files. While I was in Santorini, I started working on a children's book called Marisa, Girl of Santorini. Here is one of the illustrations created for that book, little pen drawing of the church in the village where we lived. At the same time that I was doing these drawings and working on this children's story, I was doing these abstract, processual, conceptual works. This is an event space drawing. The manuscripts in the archive go up to the present. These are notes for a project that's still in process called Phenom. Here are some of the chapter outlines, so chapter suggestions for Phenom. And here are some of the first writings in this text. Death Struggle of the One. We'll see where this project goes, but it is a project that I'm working on. There are many forms and formats in the archive, poems, reportage, essays, conceptual work, procedural work. Here's a poetic text that became part of the Stochastic Poetics project, but was written separately. Sometimes something like this shows up, and it's a pamphlet, has an original TypeScript cover and original scribbles. They're not exactly fantastic. And inside is a Xeroxed TypeScript reduced. There are only 1 or 2 copies of this in existence. Sometimes I make images like this, which was an image of somebody I met and was very impressed by. It's a watercolor image. I wrote a short script about it. It's nothing that's ever been put into print or finalized, but the images remain. The output format for this project takes several forms. One would be, as this is, PDF. Here you see one of the pages that would either be PDF or could be produced in a print format. The caption underneath the scanned image is created from the metadata that I enter into a structured data format. All of the manuscripts are stored in this space. There's some memorabilia like the photos and this little trunk made by some friends. Everything's in an archival folder. Everything has a unique ID. They're not organized chronologically, but the unique IDs allow me to sort them in the spreadsheet and work through the materials in a chronological fashion. Even though it's not, strictly speaking, a memoir, the chronology of writing is still interesting to me and reflecting on what writing modes I was using. 1991, I wrote this mystery novel. It's called Gross Morn. It was based on an experience in Newfoundland on my honeymoon. Here are notes and a map and materials that went into the project. 2002, 2003, I wrote this book, and here are images for it called Like Totally. This is the supposed cover for the project written by this in the pseudonym Don Ingmans, so it was a teen novel. To keep all of this project going, there's an elaborate workflow. I'm writing between InDesign, which is a page description format, and XML, which is a structured data format. The structured data will allow the material to be data mined, repurposed, and used for display and various other kinds of web-based activities. Here you see some of the notes that are used for keeping track, the original file IDs, the dates, and other ways of working. As I work through the material, some of the ideas about how to organize it and create metadata for description of different organizational frameworks begins to emerge. The autochronology, the places, the dates, relationships, the writing types, novels, concrete poetry, conceptual prose. Using all of these makes various different schemes that are not all organized in the same way. XML consists of semantic tags that are introduced into a XML file and format, and they allow standardization of description of the manuscript materials, and then export into an HTML format that can be used for web display. And here you see the tags that go then into making a caption. So then the caption becomes the material that's underneath the image, both in the InDesign format and then in the HTML display. Here you see what the screen looks like when you're working in the XML editor. I enjoy XML. The parsing and matching of the various components in the editor environment allows standardization to take place, and it structures the data in a way that, again, allows for both convenience and a kind of formalization of interpretive dimensions of the project. Here you see a sample for object journey. Keeping all of these things straight requires an organized file format. You see the content, the records, which are the XML records, the InDesign files, the web, which is the HTML, as well as the linked images, and some of the XSL and CSS files that are used repeatedly for structuring the data and creating a standard display along the way. Once the files are finished, then I export them into HTML and clean them up. Here you see an HTML page of the collected early works of J.D., and here you see a close-up of a fair copy of these 1962 to 64 poems produced sometime around 1969, so it's one of the earliest manuscripts I have.